Hey, this is Mark with Eigen Designs and welcome back to my channel. I recently finished this modern walnut coffee table with a nice lift top feature to it that was custom designed and built for some clients here in Houston, Texas. So in this video, I'm going to be taking you through the steps of how I built it, but I'm also going to talk about how I use the design process to collaborate with the client to ensure they get what they need. And then I'll be sharing some tips for how you can get a perfect finish on your pieces with a nice, smooth, even sheen. Let's go. It's important to finalize the design before building a piece of custom furniture for a client. Using a 3D software like SketchUp can help provide a collaborative environment to share ideas, and it helps the client visualize what their design features and requests are going to look like in their space whenever it's all done. From the builder standpoint, it can help you develop a more accurate estimate of the materials that it's going to take to build that particular piece of furniture and the amount of time it's going to take. All of this will help you as the maker accurately price the piece that you're looking to build. I'll be making this coffee table out of black walnut, and I'm going to be using some rough cut black walnut that I've had acclimating in my shop for a few months. I go through my collection and pick out some pieces that I think would look good in the build, and then I rough cut them to length so I can start the milling process. Once I've got all of my pieces cut to length, I use some painter's tape and a marker to label the stack of boards that will eventually be glued up. Remember, there's 5 different glue ups for this particular design, and I've learned the hard way that it's easy to mix up boards if you don't label them correctly. Before using my jointer, I use a square to make sure that the fence is 90 degrees to the bed. Once I've got that confirmed, then I begin jointing all the boards that I just rough cut at the miter saw. Once all the boards have been through the jointer, I then go over to my planer, and by using that flat bottom surface as a reference edge, you can thickness plane each of the boards so that the top face is now completely parallel to the bottom face. So you should have boards that are S3S coming out of this planer. The last step in the milling process is to use the table saw to rip the last rough edge off of the lumber. This will give our S3S lumber an S4S, meaning it's been surfaced on 4 sides. I'm keeping the lumber as wide as possible here because I'll make my final dimension cuts once I have the panel glue ups finished. One of the realities of dealing with solid lumber, particularly walnut, is that you have to contend with knots and imperfections in the wood. I like to get around this by filling these holes and knots with epoxy, and I generally try to color match to the color of the wood, although you could use clear or black if you wanted to. I start off by taking a little bit of Tyvek tape and putting it on the underside, and then I mix up some epoxy with a little bit of pigment to match the color of the wood that I'm using. Once I've got a batch of epoxy mixed up per the manufacturer's recommendation, I then fill all the holes with the colored epoxy and give it about 2 to 3 days to cure. You may notice that I chose to do this prior to gluing up these individual boards into a single panel, and that's because if I leave them as individual boards, I can actually remove the excess epoxy using my planer instead of sanding it down, which is going to be a much quicker process. This particular coffee table design is going to require 5 different panel glue ups. There's going to be 2 smaller ones for each of the sides, and then 3 larger panels for the tabletop, the middle shelf, and the bottom shelf. Each of the larger panels have slightly different dimensions, which is why it was important to label the boards that we were milling earlier. I'm going to start by gluing the side panels together first, and you'll notice that whenever I put these two pieces of wood together, there's a slight gap in between these two different panels. One trick to get those just perfect is to fold them together like a book and take that bottom edge and run them over the jointer together as a book matched pair. Once this is done, you can open the boards back up and you'll notice that the seam between those two different boards has completely disappeared. Now it's time to glue up the 5 different panels that are going to make up this coffee board. Something I started doing about 6 months ago is using a Festool domino to help keep the alignment of the boards during the panel glue up. This is not for strength. You could just as easily use a biscuit jointer. But what happens is, as you apply the lateral pressure from your parallel clamps during a panel glue up, sometimes your boards with the application of the glue, they kind of want to slip past each other. So having a biscuit or a domino helps keep the edges of the board aligned as you apply that lateral pressure. You can also achieve the same thing by applying some flat-edged cawls on both sides just to provide that same lateral support in lieu of using a biscuit jointer or a domino. One other thing I've learned about panel glue-ups is you really don't have to apply a ton of pressure to the panel. You just need to make sure that you've got consistent squeeze out in between the seam to make sure there's good contact during the glue-up. Once the side panels are done, I then repeated the process for the 3 larger panels that are going to make up the top, middle shelf, and bottom shelf. I only had enough clamps to do 2 panels at a time, so I actually had to come back and glue up the 3rd panel after these panels were done. But while I was waiting for these panels to dry, I shifted my attention to the side railings that are going to enclose the storage space inside of the coffee table. These are going to be highly visible, so I picked some walnut that was highly figured and then ripped them to width on the table saw. And once the panels had dried, I took them over to the table saw and ripped them to final width as well. To make this coffee table a little more interesting, I'm going to be using my CNC to carve in some slot openings on both sides of the coffee table. This was a design feature added to kind of break up the solid panel on both sides of the coffee table and just add a more modern flair to this particular design. So I hop into Fusion 360 and create a panel using the dimensions that I just took, and then create a couple of ovular openings that I'm going to use my CNC to cut out. You don't have to use a CNC for this. It's just as easy to use a combination of a router bit, a jigsaw, and a straight edge to create the exact same thing, but if I can program a robot to do this while I do other things, that's what I'm going to do. The one downside to using a CNC for this type of work is that each pass with the bit leaves behind a little striation in the wood itself. And because of the tight spaces, all of this has to be hand sanded. So this took quite a bit of time. But once that was sanded, I then picked up my router with a 1/4 inch roundover bit and went over the inside and the outside just to give those openings a really nice, smooth, curved appearance. Now that we've got all the individual pieces fabricated, it's time to assemble everything, and to do this, I'm going to be using Festool's domino. Now, unlike before in the panel glue-ups, these dominoes are going to be required for strength, because there is going to be some ingrained glue-ups that we're going to be using, and the Festool domino cuts out a mortise on both sides of the pieces that you're trying to connect, and then you put a domino that fits into that mortise and creates a loose tenon mortise joint, which is very strong. I use that in combination with some wood glue, and that's going to hold everything together as we go through the assembly. As I go through the assembly process, you may notice that I'm using some cheap packing blankets that I got off of Amazon underneath my project, and this is a tip that I picked up from Bourbon Moth Woodworking. It helps whenever you've got a sanded finished surface and you put it against another hard surface. You can often get marring and scratching on your project that you're working on. By putting a blanket below that surface, you can actually protect it from getting scratched and marred and save you from having to resand your project as you're assembling it and preparing your project for finish. They're relatively inexpensive, and you can use them just like I'm using them now, or you can also use them to protect your projects as you're transporting them to their final location. As I'm going through the assembly process, I use some of my longer parallel clamps to do some dry fitting to make sure that all the pieces are going to fit together when it's time to go to the glue up process. But while I've got everything clamped up and before I glue everything together, I take the time to install the lift top hardware temporarily while I still have access to everything. Whenever the final glue up happens, you see where the mortises are cut, there's going to be that middle shelf installed, and I won't have line of sight to anything below the tabletop surface. So by installing this now, I know where the holes are going to be to ensure that everything lines up properly after glue up. The last piece of this puzzle before we're ready for glue up is that center divider that's going to provide a little bit of support to the underside of the coffee table. I use my table saw to rip that divider to the right width, and then I use my crosscut sled to cut it to the right length. After a quick dry fit to confirm that it fits in the right place, I then used my 1/4 inch roundover bit to give the end profile of the divider the same aesthetic that we used for the slots that were cut with the CNC. Once I was comfortable with how all the pieces were dry fitting together, it was time to proceed to the glue up. I did this glue up in 2 phases. The first phase was the middle panel, the 2 side railings, and the 2 side panels. And I used Titebond 2, the dark wood glue, since we're using a darker walnut wood. And I used a ton of my parallel clamps, almost every single one that I had, to get this part set right first. Once the glue of this had dried, I then added the center divider and the lower panel, and again used the Titebond 2 dark wood glue version with some parallel clamps to get everything together nice and tight. While that glue up is drying, I turn my attention to the feet of the coffee table. And to make this, I'm going to be using some 12-quarter walnut because I want the feet to have a substantial look to them. I begin by cutting the walnut into 6 inches by 6 inch blocks, and then I use an inclinometer to set my saw blade to 75 degrees. This will provide a nice 15-degree taper on the legs that we're about to build. Once all 4 feet are cut, I do a quick sanding and then apply some wood glue and clamp the feet in place. Now it's time to add the finishing touches to close out this project. I use a 1/4 inch roundover on each of the 4 corners of the coffee table just to soften that edge and to make it consistent with the openings that we cut with the CNC and the center divider. I thought a 1/4 inch roundover might be too much for the tabletop given how thin it was, so I used an 1/8 inch roundover to soften those edges, and then I also softened the edges of a lot of surfaces and corners that people are likely to touch, as they're using this coffee table. Once that was done, I then installed the lift top hardware using the holes that we made before assembly. To finish this project, I'll be using some Rubio Monocoat Pure, which is a really nice oil wax finish that I use for most of my projects. To apply the finish, I do it in 2 stages. The first stage, I just put some of the product onto the panel and then use a plastic trowel to trowel all the product on initially. Then I'll come back with a electric buffer and actually work the product into the panel using the buffer. This will give you really good color, but can sometimes produce an inconsistent sheen, and you see it whenever it catches the light. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. In the meantime, I use a sponge to apply Rubio Monocoat to the rest of the project and then buff everything off with a clean microfiber towel. The Rubio Monocoat is bringing out a lot of the natural, beautiful colors of the walnut, but one additional step that we're going to take is on the coffee tabletop, since that's going to receive a lot of natural sunlight and will highlight any inconsistencies in the sheen of the coffee table. To do this, we're going to be using a maroon Scotch-Brite pad along with a random orbital sander, and we're going to use that to scuff up the surface of the tabletop. What you're looking for here is a nice, consistent, cloudy haze across the entire surface. Once you've achieved that, you can take some water and a microfiber cloth and wipe off all the excess dust left behind by the maroon Scotch-Brite pad. Once that dries, you apply another coat of Rubio Monocoat, troweling it on with a plastic trowel and wiping off all the excess with a microfiber cloth. And what you're left with is a beautiful, consistent finish that's got a nice, even sheen whenever you look at it in the light. So this is how the final coffee table looked in the client's home. The coloring of the walnut matches really well with the natural tones of the flooring, and the size of the coffee table fits right within the space that they have. The clients also requested there to be a lift top mechanism to not only provide concealed storage space within the coffee table, but also provide an elevated working position to make the living room space more functional. All right, that's going to be it for this video. I had a ton of fun making this coffee table, and the positive reception from the clients made this even better. If you like this type of content, make sure to subscribe to my channel. I've always got stuff like this coming out, so I will see you on the next one.